The last thing I remember before hitting the hardwood floor was the sound of my brother's textbook connecting with the back of my skull. Not the thud of impact, but the sharp crack that echoed through our living room like a gunshot. Then everything went white, then black. Then I was staring at the ceiling fans spinning lazily above me while my vision doubled and tripled and my ears rang like church bells. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus stood over me, calculus book still in his hand, his face a mixture of shock and something else, something that looked almost like satisfaction. "She's fine," he said to our parents, who had rushed in from the kitchen. "She was being dramatic about my music again. Just give her a little tap to shut her up." A little tap? That's what he called the blow that left me seeing stars and tasting copper in my mouth? That's what my parents chose to believe as they helped me to the couch, as Mom pressed an ice pack to the growing knot on my head, as Dad muttered about siblings needing to get along better. The headache started immediately, but it wasn't just pain. It was like someone had installed a strobe light behind my eyes that I couldn't turn off. Every sound felt amplified, every light felt like needles. When I tried to tell Mom that something felt really wrong, that this wasn't like the other times Marcus had pushed me or grabbed my arm too hard, she just adjusted the ice pack and said the words that would haunt me for months. "Sage, honey, you know he doesn't mean it. He's got so much pressure with his senior year and college applications. You can't keep escalating things like this." Escalating, as if asking him to turn down his music while I studied was an act of war. As if existing in the same house as Marcus was somehow a provocation that justified whatever he chose to do to me. But I knew this was different. The way my thoughts felt fuzzy and disconnected. The way I couldn't quite focus on anything for more than a few seconds. The way standing up made the whole room tilt, like we were on a boat. I'd had headaches before, but nothing like this. "I think I need to go to the hospital," I whispered, my words coming out slower than I intended. Dad looked up from his laptop, where he was already back to answering work emails. "For a bump on the head? Sage, you're being dramatic. Take some ibuprofen and sleep it off." Sleep it off, like consciousness was optional, like the throbbing in my skull was something I could just decide to ignore. Marcus had disappeared to his room by then, cranking his music back up as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just used a textbook like a weapon, as if this sound of my head hitting the floor wasn't still echoing in all our ears. I spent that night staring at the ceiling, afraid to close my eyes because every time I did, the room would spin and my stomach would lurch. I threw up twice, quietly, into the wastebasket beside my bed. I kept waiting for Mom to check on me, to notice that I hadn't eaten dinner, to see that something was seriously wrong. She never came. The next morning, I could barely lift my head off the pillow. The light streaming through my bedroom window felt like acid on my eyes. When I tried to read a text message from my friend Jenna, the words swam around the screen like they were underwater. "Mom," I called weakly, "something's really wrong." She appeared in my doorway, already dressed for her job at the insurance office, checking her watch. "Sage, you missed your alarm. You're going to be late for school." "I can't go to school. I can't even stand up without everything spinning." She sighed the way she always did when I was being inconvenient. "Honey, you can't miss school over a little headache. Senior year is too important. Just take some Tylenol and you'll be fine by lunch." But I wasn't fine by lunch. I wasn't fine for days. I stumbled through classes in a fog, unable to concentrate, forgetting simple words mid-sentence. My grades, which had always been solid, started slipping. Teachers asked if I was okay, if something was going on at home. I wanted to tell them, but what would I say? That my brother hit me with a book and now I couldn't think straight? That my parents thought I was faking it for attention? A week after the incident, I was sitting in AP biology when Mrs. Chen was explaining something about neural pathways, and I suddenly couldn't understand a single word she was saying. It was like she was speaking a foreign language. I raised my hand to ask if I could go to the nurse, but when I stood up, my legs gave out and I collapsed right there in middle of class. I woke up in the nurse's office with Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Rodriguez hovering over me with worried expressions. "Sage, how long have you been having these symptoms?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked, shining a small flashlight in my eyes. "Since last week," I said, though even forming the words felt like pushing them through molasses. "What happened last week?" I hesitated. "My brother, there was an accident. He hit me with a book." Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Rodriguez exchanged a look that I couldn't quite interpret. "Sage, these symptoms you're describing, the confusion, the balance problems, the vision issues, these could be signs of a concussion. A concussion is a brain injury. It's serious." Brain injury. The word sent a chill through me. Not because I was scared, but because finally someone was saying what I'd known all along. This wasn't normal. This wasn't something I could just shake off. "I need to call your parents," Mrs. Rodriguez continued. "You need to see a doctor immediately." When Mom arrived at school, her face was flushed with embarrassment rather than concern. "I'm sorry you had to call me out of work for this," she said to Mrs. Rodriguez. "Sage has been having some attention-seeking behaviors lately." Mrs. Rodriguez's expression hardened slightly. "Mrs. Patterson, your daughter collapsed in class. She's showing clear signs of a potential brain injury. This isn't attention-seeking behavior. This is a medical emergency." On the drive to the doctor's office, Mom was silent except for occasional sighs and the muttered comment, "I hope you're happy now." Happy, as if this was what I'd wanted. As if lying in that nurse's office feeling like my brain was wrapped in cotton was some kind of victory. Dr. Martinez took one look at me and immediately ordered a CT scan. While we waited for the results, he asked detailed questions about what had happened, how I'd been feeling, what symptoms I had experienced. For the first time in a week, someone was taking me seriously. "Mrs. Patterson," he said when he came back with the results, his voice grave, "your daughter has a significant concussion. The scan shows swelling and bruising on her brain. This is consistent with a traumatic brain injury." The words hung in the air like smoke. Mom's face went pale. "But it was just a book," she whispered. "He just tapped her with a book." Dr. Martinez pulled up the scan on his computer screen. Even I could see the dark areas that didn't belong there, the swelling that looked like storm clouds in my skull. "Mrs. Patterson, this level of injury doesn't happen from a tap. This is the result of significant blunt force trauma to the head. Your daughter has been walking around with a brain injury for over a week without treatment. She could have died." Could have died. The words echoed in the small examination room. "I'm going to need to report this," Dr. Martinez continued. "When a minor comes in with injuries like this, especially when there's been a delay in seeking treatment, we're required by law to contact Child Protective Services." Mom's face went from pale to red in an instant. "That's not necessary. It was an accident. Her brother didn't mean to hurt her." "Ma'am, intent doesn't change the medical reality. Your daughter has a traumatic brain injury that went untreated for over a week because the family didn't recognize the severity of her symptoms. Whether it was intentional or not, this constitutes medical neglect." That's when I knew everything was about to change. Not because of the brain scan or the doctor's words or even the mention of CPS, but because of the look on my mother's face. It wasn't concern for my health or guilt over not getting me help sooner. It was anger at me for making this public, for forcing her to confront what she'd been pretending wasn't real. The social worker arrived at our house that evening. Her name was Linda Vasquez, and she had kind eyes and a gentle voice that reminded me of my second-grade teacher. She sat in our living room, the same room where Marcus had hit me, and asked questions while my parents sat on the opposite couch, looking like they were being interrogated for war crimes. "Sage, can you tell me what happened the night you were injured?" I looked at my parents, then back at Linda. "I was studying for a chemistry test. Marcus had his music really loud, and I asked him to turn it down. He got angry and hit me with his calculus book." "Where did he hit you?" "The back of my head." "And what happened after that?" "I fell down. I was dizzy and nauseous. I told my parents I thought I needed to go to the hospital, but they said I was being dramatic. Linda made notes in her folder. How did you feel over the next few days? Confused, dizzy. I couldn't concentrate. I threw up. I couldn't sleep. Everything felt wrong. And when did you finally receive medical attention? When I collapsed at school. The nurse called my mom. Throughout this conversation, I could feel my parents' eyes on me like lasers. Mom kept clearing her throat as if she wanted to interrupt, to correct my version of events, to explain how I was exaggerating or misremembering. But Linda never gave her the chance. When Linda finished with me, she spoke with my parents separately. I could hear raised voices from the kitchen, though I couldn't make out the words. When they came back, Mom's face was streaked with tears, and Dad looked like he'd aged 10 years. Sage, Linda said, I'm going to be working with your family to make sure you're safe and that you get the medical follow-up you need. You'll be staying with your Aunt Sarah for a few days while we sort things out. Aunt Sarah lived across town in a small apartment that smelled like vanilla candles and had plants in every window. She was Mom's younger sister, but they rarely spoke. I'd always wondered why. Your mom called me, Sarah said, as she made up the couch for me to sleep on. Told me you'd been having some behavioral problems and needed a change of scenery. Behavioral problems. Even now, even with medical evidence, even with the social worker involved, Mom was still reframing this as my fault. That's not exactly what happened, I said quietly. Sarah sat down beside me on the couch. Sage, honey, I've known your mother my whole life. I also know what it's like to live in a house where the truth gets twisted until you don't know which way is up anymore. Why don't you tell me what really happened? So I did. I told her about Marcus and his temper, about the way he'd gotten more violent as he'd gotten older, about how Mom always made excuses and Dad always looked the other way. I told her about the book and the blood and the week of agony that my parents dismissed as attention-seeking. When I finished, Sarah was quiet for a long time. I'm so sorry, she finally said. I'm sorry we didn't see it. I'm sorry we didn't protect you. That night, for the first time in over a week, I slept through the night. Maybe it was being away from the house where everything had happened. Maybe it was having someone finally believe me. Or maybe it was just exhaustion from carrying the weight of everyone else's denial for so long. The next morning, Linda called to tell us that the school district was conducting their own investigation. Marcus had been suspended pending the outcome. CPS was requiring him to undergo anger management counseling and the family to participate in therapy. What about my parents? I asked. They're cooperating for now, Linda said carefully. But Sage, I want you to know that you have options. You don't have to go back to that house if you don't feel safe. Don't feel safe. In my own home, with my own family. The words should have been devastating, but instead they felt like permission. Permission to trust my instincts. Permission to put my safety first. Permission to stop pretending that what had happened was normal or acceptable. 3 days later, I had another appointment with Dr. Martinez to check on my progress. The headaches were getting better, but slowly. My concentration was still poor. He said it could take months for my brain to fully heal. The good news is that young brains are resilient. But Sage, I want to be clear about something. What happened to you could have been fatal. A blow to the head that causes this level of injury is not an accident.
This is assault. Assault. There it was. The word no one in my family wanted to say. I'm recommending that you don't return to that environment until there's been significant intervention, he continued. Your brain needs time to heal, and stress can actually slow the recovery process. When we got back to Sarah's apartment, there were 17 missed calls on my phone, all from Mom. I listened to the voicemails in order. They started apologetic, moved frustrated, and ended in full rage. Sage, you're tearing this family apart. Marcus is devastated. He's lost his spot on the debate team. College coaches are pulling their interest. You're ruining his future over an accident. Over nothing. Over nothing. A traumatic brain injury was nothing? Call me back. We need to fix this before it goes too far. But it had already gone too far. It had gone too far the moment Marcus picked up that book. It had gone too far when my parents chose to believe his version over my injuries. It had gone too far when they let me suffer for a week because addressing it would have been inconvenient. I didn't call her back. That evening, Sarah and I were making dinner when there was a pounding on the door. Through the peephole, I could see Marcus standing on the doorstep, his face red with anger. "Don't answer it," I whispered. Sarah looked through the peephole and immediately stepped back. "I'm calling the police." "Please don't leave me," Marcus shouted through the door. "This is insane! I barely touched you! You're destroying our family over nothing!" The police arrived within minutes. I watched from Sarah the window as they spoke with Marcus on the sidewalk, as he gestured wildly and pointed toward the apartment. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could see the officers' expressions grow more serious as the conversation continued. One of the officers came to the door. "Are you Sage Patterson?" "Yes." "Your brother was asking to speak with you. We've informed him that he's not allowed to contact you directly, and that showing up here violates the protection order that was filed yesterday." "Protection order?" I hadn't known about any protection order. "Linda filed it this morning," Sarah explained after the officers left. She said given the circumstances, it was the safest thing to do. That night, I lay on Sarah's couch, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the word family. For 17 years, I'd believed that family meant loyalty at any cost, that family meant protecting each other's secrets, that family meant never letting outsiders see the ugly truth. But Linda had said something that stuck with me. Real families protect each other. They don't sacrifice one member to save another. Marcus had hurt me badly enough to cause a brain injury, and my parents' first instinct had been to minimize it, to hide it, to make it my fault. When the medical evidence made denial impossible, they'd still chosen to blame me for the consequences. That wasn't family. That was a conspiracy. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Jennifer Walsh, met with me beforehand to explain the process. "This is a felony assault case," she said. "Your brother is 18, so he'll be tried as an adult. The medical evidence is very strong in your favor." "What about my parents? Are they in trouble too?" "The medical neglect charge is still being reviewed. At minimum, they'll be required to complete parenting classes and family therapy. But Sage, I want you to understand something. This case isn't about revenge. It's about accountability. What happened to you was serious, and there need to be consequences." The night before the hearing, Mom called Sarah's landline. Sarah handed me the phone with a questioning look. "Hi, Mom." "Sage?" Her voice was strained, exhausted. "I've been thinking about what you said, about feeling unsafe. I want you to know that Marcus feels terrible about what happened." "Does he?" "Of course he does. He never meant to hurt you so badly. You have to believe that." There it was again. Intent. As if Marcus's intentions mattered more than my brain injury. As if his regret could undo the damage. "Mom, he hit me hard enough to cause swelling in my brain. The doctor said I could have died." "But you didn't die. You're fine now." "I'm not fine. I still get headaches. I still have trouble concentrating. My brain is still healing from what he did to me." A long pause. The prosecutor called today. She said they're offering a plea deal. If Marcus pleads guilty to a lesser charge, he might avoid jail time. What do you want me to say to that? "I want you to think about his future, about our family, about what's best for everyone." "What's best for everyone? Never what's best for me." "Mom, what's best for everyone is for Marcus to face consequences for what he did. What's best for everyone is for our family to stop pretending that violence is acceptable if you don't mean it." "Sage, please. He's your brother. He's also someone who gave me a brain injury and then let me suffer for a week without medical care." Another long pause. "I don't know how to fix this." For the first time in the conversation, she sounded genuine, vulnerable, like she actually understood the magnitude of what had happened. "You can't fix it, Mom, but you can stop making it worse." The hearing was in a small courtroom that smelled like old wood and coffee. Marcus sat at the defendant's table in a navy suit, his hair freshly cut, looking like the perfect college-bound student he'd always been groomed to be. His lawyer had clearly coached him well. He kept his eyes downcast, the picture of remorse. My parents sat on the front row behind him. Mom dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Dad stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. When it was my turn to testify, I stood up slowly, still feeling slightly unsteady on my feet.
The prosecutor had prepared me for the questions, but standing there with all those eyes on me, I felt 17 and small and very alone. "Can you tell the court what happened on the evening of March 15th? I looked directly at Marcus as I spoke. "I was studying in the living room. My brother had his music turned up very loud, and I asked him to turn it down because I had a test the next day. He got angry and told me to shut up. When I said I just needed to concentrate, he picked up his calculus textbook and hit me in the back of the head with it. What happened after that? I fell to the floor. Everything was spinning. I was nauseous and dizzy. I told my parents I thought I needed to go to the hospital, but they said I was being dramatic." "How did you feel over the next week?" "Confused. I couldn't concentrate. I had severe headaches. I threw up several times. I couldn't sleep. But my parents kept insisting I was fine and that I needed to go to school." "When did you finally receive medical attention?" "When I collapsed in my biology class. The school nurse called my mother, and she took me to see Dr. Martinez." "And what did Dr. Martinez find?" "That I had a concussion, a traumatic brain injury. He said the brain scan showed swelling and bruising, and that I could have died if I'd gone longer without treatment." The defense attorney, a middle-aged man with silver hair, cross-examined me gently but persistently. "Ms. Patterson, isn't it true that you and your brother often had conflicts?" "We had disagreements, yes." "And isn't it true that you often exaggerated these conflicts to get attention from your parents?" "No, that's not true." "But you admit that you've made complaints about your brother's behavior before?" "I've told my parents when he's been aggressive, yes." "And in this particular instance, isn't it possible that your brother simply made contact with you accidentally while trying to move past you?" I looked at the brain scan images displayed on the courtroom monitor. "You don't accidentally cause that level of brain damage." The prosecutor stood up. "Objection. The witness isn't qualified to make medical determinations." Sustained. But the point had been made. The brain scan didn't lie. The medical evidence didn't care about family dynamics or teenage conflicts or college applications. It only showed the truth. Someone had hit me hard enough to injure my brain. Dr. Martinez testified next, explaining the severity of the injury in clinical terms that made several people in the courtroom wince. The radiologist who had reviewed my scans testified about the pattern of injury being consistent with blunt force trauma. The school nurse testified about the symptoms I'd displayed and her concerns about the delay in treatment. Marcus's attorney called character witnesses, teachers who spoke about his academic achievements, the debate coach who talked about his leadership qualities, a family friend who described him as gentle and thoughtful. But none of them had been in that living room. None of them had seen the look in his eyes when he picked up that book. None of them had brain scans showing the damage he'd caused. When the prosecutor made her closing argument, she held up a printout of my brain scan. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not a case about teenage sibling rivalry. This is not a case about an accident or a misunderstanding. This is a case about assault resulting in a traumatic brain injury. The medical evidence is clear. The defendant struck the victim with enough force to cause swelling and bruising to her brain. She could have died. The fact that she survived doesn't make this any less serious." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. "On the charge of assault in the second degree, we find the defendant guilty." I felt Sarah's hand squeeze mine. Across the courtroom, I could hear Mom crying. Not for me, for Marcus. During the sentencing phase, 2 weeks later, both sides presented impact statements. Marcus's lawyer brought in more character witnesses, a psychologist who testified about the stress of senior year, and a counselor who spoke about his potential for rehabilitation. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the podium with a prepared statement, but when I looked out at the courtroom, the words I'd written seemed inadequate.
Your Honor, I began, 6 weeks ago, I was a straight-A student planning for college. I played violin in the school orchestra. I tutored younger students in chemistry. I had plans and dreams and a future I was excited about. I paused, looking directly at Marcus. 6 weeks ago, my brother hit me with a textbook hard enough to cause a traumatic brain injury. For a week afterward, while I suffered from symptoms that could have killed me, my family told me I was being dramatic. They prioritized my convenience over my life. Another pause. I'm not standing here asking for revenge. I'm asking for accountability. What my brother did to me wasn't an accident. It wasn't a moment of teenage angst. It was assault. And the way my family handled it afterward, minimizing my injuries, delaying my treatment, blaming me for the consequences, that was betrayal. I looked toward my parents. I've learned something important through all of this. Family isn't defined by shared DNA. It's defined by how you treat each other when things go wrong. Real families protect their vulnerable members. They don't sacrifice them to preserve someone else's reputation. I turned toward the judge. Marcus needs to understand that his actions have consequences. Not because I want him to suffer, but because someone else's safety might depend on it someday. The brain scan showed the truth about what happened to me. I hope this courtroom will show the truth about what happens when you hurt someone and try to pretend it doesn't matter. The judge sentenced Marcus to 6 months in county jail, 2 years of probation, anger management counseling, and community service. He would also have to pay my medical bills and attend therapy. It wasn't the maximum sentence, but it was real consequences. It was acknowledgement that what happened to me mattered. As we left the courthouse, I walked past my parents on the steps. Mom reached out as if to touch my arm, but I stepped away. "Sage," she said, her voice breaking, "when will you come home?" I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had given birth to me, but had never learned how to protect me. I am home, just not with you.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The living room looked exactly the same, but it felt different, smaller, less important, like a stage set after the play has ended. In my bedroom, I packed my violin, my books, the photos from my wall. I left behind the family pictures, the memories that felt too heavy to carry. As I was folding clothes into a suitcase, I found a letter on my desk. My name was written on the front in Marcus's handwriting. Inside, 3 pages of his careful script. "Sage, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I needed you to know that I never meant for things to go this far. I was stressed about college and SATs and everything, and I took it out on you. That was wrong, but I never meant to hurt you so badly. I hope someday you can forgive me." I read it twice, looking for something that resembled real accountability, an acknowledgement that he had made a choice to hit me, an understanding that intent doesn't undo damage, a recognition that going too far was an inadequate description of assault. Instead, I found more of the same: excuses about stress, minimization of the severity, a request for forgiveness without any evidence that he understood what he needed to be forgiven for. I folded the letter and put it in the trash. That evening, Sarah and I sat on her couch, eating takeout Chinese food and watching bad reality TV. It was ordinary and peaceful and safe. Everything my life had been missing. "I talked to a college counselor today," I told her, "about deferring my admission for a year. Maybe getting some tutoring to deal with the concentration issues." "That sounds smart. Your brain needs time to heal." "Sarah, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why don't you and Mom talk much?"
She was quiet for a while, twirling lo mein around her chopsticks. "Your mom and I grew up in a house where keeping secrets was more important than keeping safe," she finally said, "where family loyalty meant never talking about what happened behind closed doors. I decided a long time ago that I couldn't live that way." "Is that why you believe me about Marcus?" "I believe you because I know what it feels like to be told you're crazy when you're actually being hurt. I believe you because I've seen your brain scans. But mostly, I believe you because I've watched you these past few weeks, and I can see that telling the truth cost you everything. People don't usually lie when the truth would be easier." That night, I lay in bed thinking about the conversation with Sarah, about the letter from Marcus, about the look on Mom's face when the verdict was read. I thought about the brain scan that had changed everything, the objective proof that my reality was real. For 17 years, I'd lived in a house where the truth was whatever was most convenient for the people with the most power, where my pain was always less important than Marcus's reputation, where my safety was always secondary to family appearance. The brain scan had changed that. Medical evidence doesn't play favorites. It doesn't care about college applications or family dynamics or keeping secrets. It just shows what is. I pulled out my laptop and started typing. My name is Sage Patterson. 6 weeks ago, my brother gave me a concussion, and my parents said he didn't mean it. The brain scan said different. I wrote for hours about the assault, about the denial, about the week of suffering while my family pretended nothing was wrong, about the collapse at school, about Dr. Martinez, about the social worker who finally made someone listen. I wrote about the brain scan that became my truth teller, the medical evidence that cut through all the gaslighting and manipulation and forced everyone to confront reality. I wrote about the court case, about standing up in front of strangers and telling the truth about my family, about watching my parents choose Marcus's future over my safety, even after everything that had happened. I wrote about learning the difference between family and people who share your DNA, about discovering that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need protection from. When I finished, it was almost on. I had 20 pages of raw, honest truth about what it means to be betrayed by the people who are supposed to love you most. I titled it "When Your Brain Scan Becomes Your Truth Teller," and sent it to the blog editor at the local newspaper who had reached out after the trial. 3 days later, it was published. Within hours, it had been shared hundreds of times. My inbox filled with messages from other people with similar stories. Young women who had been hurt by family members and told they were exaggerating. People who had brain injuries that went undiagnosed because their families didn't want to deal with the inconvenience. But the message that stopped me cold came from an address I didn't recognize. "Sage, I don't know you, but I'm Marcus's ex-girlfriend from sophomore year. I wanted you to know that what happened to you wasn't the first time. He hit me too, more than once. I never told anyone because he always said it was an accident, that he didn't mean it. Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth. Maybe now other people will believe it when someone shows them who they really are." I stared at the message for a long time. Marcus had done this before, to someone else. Someone who had also been told it was an accident, who had also been gaslit into believing her pain didn't matter. I forwarded the message to Jennifer Walsh, the prosecutor. Within an hour, she called me back. "Sage, this could be significant. Would you be willing to put me in touch with this young woman?" "Of course." "There's something else I need to tell you. 2 other families have come forward since your story was published. Similar situations. Siblings who caused injuries and parents who covered it up. Your case is inspiring other people to speak up." Other people. Other families where violence was dismissed as accidents, where medical evidence was ignored in favor of maintaining appearances. That afternoon, I got a call from a producer at a local news station. They wanted to do a follow-up story about the broader implications of my case, about how many young people suffer brain injuries that go undiagnosed, how many families prioritize reputation over safety. I said yes.
The interview aired on a Thursday evening. I sat in Sarah's living room watching myself on television talking about brain scans and family denial and the importance of medical evidence. The reporter had included interviews with Dr. Martinez about concussion symptoms, with Linda Vasquez about mandatory reporting, with other young people who had similar experiences. After the broadcast, my phone started ringing. Reporters from other stations, advocacy groups working on domestic violence, a literary agent who thought my story could be a book. But the call that mattered most came from the number I didn't recognize. "Is this Sage Patterson?" "Yes. This is Dr. Rebecca Chen from the Children's Hospital. I saw your story on the news. We're starting a new program for adolescents with traumatic brain injuries, specifically focusing on cases where there's been delayed diagnosis due to family factors. We could use someone with your experience to help develop the program."
Would you be interested in talking? I looked around Sarah's apartment, at the safe space she'd created for me, at the life I was building away from the family that had failed me. "Yes," I said. "I'd be very interested." 6 months later, I was working part-time at the hospital while finishing my senior year through an independent study program. My concentration had improved significantly, though I still had days when the headaches came back. Dr. Martinez said that was normal, that brain injuries could take years to fully heal. The program at Children's Hospital was thriving. We'd helped dozens of young people get proper medical care for head injuries that their families had minimized or ignored. We'd developed screening protocols for emergency rooms to identify cases of possible abuse or neglect. We'd trained social workers to recognize the signs of traumatic brain injury in children who might not be able to advocate for themselves. Most importantly, we'd created a space where young people could tell their stories and be believed, where medical evidence was trusted over family narratives, where brain scans were allowed to speak their truth. I still lived with Sarah, though I'd moved into the second bedroom when she realized I wasn't going back home. We'd created our own kind of family, one based on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than obligation and denial. Marcus had served his 6 months and was now in community college, working with a therapist and attending court-mandated anger management. He'd written me several more letters, all of which went unanswered. Not because I was holding on to anger, but because I had nothing to say to someone who still couldn't acknowledge the full truth of what he'd done. Mom called occasionally, usually on holidays or birthdays. The conversations were stilted and careful, full of things we couldn't say. She'd ask when I was coming home, and I'd remind her that I was already there. She'd mention family therapy, and I'd tell her that therapy only worked when people were willing to be honest about what needed healing. Dad had stopped calling altogether. But the silence from my biological family had been filled with voices from the community I'd found. The other survivors I'd met through the hospital program, the medical professionals who took traumatic brain injury seriously, the advocates working to change how families and institutions respond to domestic violence. I'd learned that healing didn't require forgiveness from the people who had hurt me. It didn't require reconciliation or family reunions or pretending that everything was fine. Healing required truth, appropriate medical care, and a support system that prioritized my safety over everyone else's comfort. The brain scan that had started it all was framed on my desk now, next to my acceptance letter to pre-med programs for the following fall. It reminded me daily that objective truth exists, even when people try to deny it. That medical evidence doesn't lie, even when families do. That sometimes the most important thing you can do is trust what your body is telling you, even when everyone around you is saying you're wrong. On the anniversary of the assault, I gave a presentation to medical students about recognizing traumatic brain injury in cases involving family violence. I talked about the importance of believing patients, especially young patients who might be afraid to contradict their family's narratives. Medicine is supposed to be objective, I told them. But too often, social factors interfere with proper diagnosis and treatment. When a teenager comes to your emergency room with symptoms of head injury and the family insists it was just a minor bump, order the brain scan anyway. Trust the medical evidence over the family story. You might be the only person in that young person's life who's willing to see the truth. After the presentation, a young medical student approached me. "I have a question about something you said earlier, about trusting medical evidence over family narratives. What if the family really believes it was an accident?" I thought about my mother's voice on that first phone call, insisting that Marcus didn't mean it.
about all the times she'd convinced herself that his violence was really just stress or misunderstanding or teenage drama. Belief doesn't change the medical reality, I said. Intent doesn't undo a brain injury. When someone is hurt badly enough to show up on a brain scan, the question isn't whether the perpetrator meant to cause that much damage. The question is how to make sure it doesn't happen again. That evening, I sat in my room working on the book I'd been writing about my experience. The literary agent had been right. There was a market for stories about medical advocacy, about young people standing up to family systems that prioritized appearance over safety. But more than that, there was a need for these stories. Every week, I heard from young people who had read my original essay and recognized their own experiences, who had been told they were being dramatic when they were actually being injured, who had learned to distrust their own perceptions because the adults around them consistently invalidated their reality. I wrote for them. For the teenagers sitting in emergency rooms with parents who insist they were fine. For the young adults learning to navigate medical systems without family support. For anyone who had ever been told that their pain was less important than someone else's reputation. The book would be titled The Truth Scan: How Medical Evidence Saved My Life When My Family Wouldn't. It would include not just my story, but interviews with other survivors, perspectives from medical professionals, and practical advice for young people dealing with family denial of abuse. As I wrote the final chapter, I thought about the girl I'd been a year ago, the one who believed that family loyalty meant accepting violence, who thought that keeping secrets was a form of strength, who had been taught that her safety mattered less than her brother's future. That girl was destroyed the night Marcus hit me with that textbook. But she'd been reborn in Dr. Martinez's office when someone finally looked at the evidence and told her the truth. My name is Sage Patterson. A year ago, my brother gave me a concussion, and my parents said he didn't mean it. The brain scan said different. And that brain scan didn't just diagnose my injury. It diagnosed the sickness in my family that had allowed the injury to happen in the first place. Now I work to make sure other young people have access to the truth-telling power of medical evidence. Because sometimes a brain scan is the only witness that can't be silenced, the only voice that can't be discredited, the only proof that can cut through years of gaslighting and denial. The truth was always there, written in the bruising and swelling of my injured brain. It just took someone willing to look at it, believe it, and act on it to set me free. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing organic chemistry notes in the hospital cafeteria. The sender's address made my stomach clench. mpatterson.insurance@outlook.com, Mom's work email. She'd never contacted me through professional channels before. The subject line read, "Please read this completely before deleting." I stared at the notification for several minutes, my coffee growing cold as other medical students chatted around me about upcoming exams and residency applications. 2 years had passed since the trial, since I'd walked away from the family that chose Marcus's future over my brain injury. 2 years of building a life that prioritized truth over convenience, safety over appearance. But seeing Mom's name in my inbox still made my chest tight with something that wasn't quite anger anymore, but wasn't forgiveness either. It was the complicated ache of loving someone who had fundamentally failed you when you needed them most. I opened the email. "Sage, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but something has happened that I think you need to know about. Marcus was arrested again last night. This time it was his girlfriend, Brittany. She's in the hospital with a broken orbital bone and a concussion. The police said they had the same kind of brain scan results as you did. They're calling it domestic violence, not an accident this time. I keep thinking about what you said in court, about how there would be other girls if he didn't face real consequences. You were right. I was wrong. I don't expect you to respond to this, but I needed you to know that I finally understand what I couldn't see before, what I chose not to see." I read the message 3 times before the words fully registered. Another girl, another brain scan, another family discovering that Marcus's violence wasn't accidental, wasn't stress-related, wasn't something that could be explained away with good grades and college potential. My hands were shaking as I forwarded the email to Jennifer Walsh, the prosecutor who had handled my case. She called back within an hour. "Sage, I just spoke with the detective handling the new case. Brittany Chen is 22, a nursing student. She's been dating your brother for about 8 months. According to the police report, he hit her with a metal water bottle during an argument about her working late shifts. The details were horrifyingly familiar. The weapon of convenience. The argument that escalated without warning.
The immediate attempt to minimize and explain away the violence. What did her family say when she went to the hospital? That's the difference this time. Brittany drove herself to the emergency room. She told the doctors exactly what happened and asked them to call the police. Her family is supporting her decision to press charges. I felt a strange mixture of relief and grief. Relief that Brittany had advocates, that she hadn't been gaslit into accepting Marcus's version of events. Grief for the me who had suffered alone for a week, whose family had chosen denial over protection. There's something else, Jennifer continued. The defense attorney is trying to argue that your case was an anomaly, that Marcus has learned from his mistakes and this incident with Brittany was a moment of weakness under stress. They're claiming he's not a pattern offender. Pattern offender? 2 documented brain injuries within 3 years? How many incidents had there been that never made it to a hospital? How many girlfriends who had been convinced they were being too sensitive, too dramatic, too demanding? What can I do to help? The prosecutor on Brittany's case wants to introduce evidence of Marcus's prior conviction. Your testimony about the pattern of behavior could be crucial. But Sage, I want you to think carefully about this. Testifying would mean putting yourself back in a courtroom with your family, reliving everything again. I looked around the hospital cafeteria, at the medical students discussing cases with the same analytical distance I'd learned to apply to my own trauma. In 2 years of working with brain injury patients, I'd seen dozens of young people whose families had failed them in similar ways. I'd helped create protocols that prioritized medical evidence over family narratives, that treated traumatic brain injury as the serious condition it was, regardless of the perpetrator's relationship to the victim. But I'd never had to face Marcus again, never had to sit across a courtroom from parents who still believed, on some level, that protecting their son was more important than protecting his victims. "I'll do it," I said. Brittany shouldn't have to face this alone. That evening, I called Sarah to tell her about the email, about the new case, and about my decision to testify. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. "How do you feel about seeing them again?" she asked. Terrified, I admitted, but also angry. Not the kind of anger I used to carry, the helpless, consuming kind. This is different. This is the anger that comes from knowing that everything I predicted would happen if Marcus didn't face real consequences has come true. What about your mother's email? The part where she said she finally understands? I'd been avoiding thinking about that part, about the years too late acknowledgement that my reality had been real all along. I think she's telling the truth about understanding now, but understanding after another girl gets hurt doesn't undo the damage of not understanding when it was me. Sarah was quiet again. Do you want her to understand? Are you glad she finally sees it? The question caught me off guard. For 2 years, I'd imagined what it would feel like if my parents ever admitted they'd been wrong, if they ever acknowledged that their response to my assault had been a betrayal as devastating as the assault itself. I thought it would feel like vindication, like finally being seen. Instead, it felt empty, like receiving an apology for something that couldn't be apologized for. I'm glad for Brittany, I said finally, because it means my mother might actually support her instead of undermining her case. But for me, it's too late for understanding to matter. The preliminary hearing for Marcus's new case was scheduled for the following week. I arranged to take time off from my hospital internship and my pre-med classes, though explaining the situation to my professors was more complicated than I expected. I need to testify in a domestic violence case, I told Dr. Elizabeth Wong, the neurology professor who had become something of a mentor. Are you comfortable discussing the details?
I'd never told my professors about my personal connection to traumatic brain injury, though I suspected some of them had guessed from the intensity of my focus on the subject. It's my brother's case. He assaulted me 2 years ago, gave me a concussion. Now he's done the same thing to his girlfriend. Dr. Wong's expression shifted from professional concern to something more personal. Sage, I had no idea. I'm so sorry. The thing is, I'm not sure how to balance this. I want to help this girl, but I also don't want my personal situation to affect my academic standing or my credibility as a future physician. Your personal experience with traumatic brain injury doesn't undermine your credibility, it enhances it. You understand these injuries from both a clinical and a patient perspective. That's invaluable. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But I want you to be prepared for the fact that testifying might affect you in ways you don't expect. Even when you think you've processed trauma, confronting it again can reopen wounds you thought you'd healed. That night, I reread the victim impact statement I'd given at Marcus's original sentencing. The words seemed like they'd been written by a different person, someone younger, more raw, more desperate to be believed. Now, 2 years later, I had medical training, professional experience, and a platform that gave my voice weight and authority. I also had something I didn't possess before: absolute certainty that I'd made the right choice in walking away from my family. The courthouse looked exactly the same, but everything had changed. I arrived wearing scrubs under my coat, having come directly from a shift at the hospital. My hair was pulled back in the practical ponytail I'd adopted for medical work, and I carried a bag containing both my testimony notes and the latest research on traumatic brain injury and domestic violence. Brittany Chen was sitting with the prosecutor when I arrived, a small woman with fierce eyes and a healing bruise along her jawline. She stood when I entered the conference room. "You're Sage Patterson," she said. "I read your book." I'd forgotten that my story was public now, published and available to anyone who wanted to understand the intersection of family violence and medical advocacy. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances," I said. "Don't be sorry. You saved my life." "I don't understand." Brittany sat back down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "When Marcus hit me, when I was lying on his apartment floor with blood running down my face, I remembered something from your book about how your family told you it was an accident, how they convinced you not to go to the hospital right away. I remembered thinking, if I don't go now, if I let him tell me this was my fault or that I'm overreacting, I'll end up like the girl in that book, hurt and alone and not believed." She looked directly at me. So I got in my car and drove to the emergency room. I told them exactly what happened and asked them to call the police. I did that because you wrote about what happens when you don't. The prosecutor, a woman named Sarah Kim, cleared her throat gently. Brittany's case is unusually strong because she sought immediate medical attention and was completely honest with medical personnel from the beginning. But the defense is going to argue that Marcus has changed since his conviction in your case, that he's received counseling and anger management, that this incident with Brittany was a moment of weakness under stress. They're claiming he's not a pattern offender. Pattern offender. 2 documented brain injuries within 3 years? How many incidents had there been that never made it to a hospital? How many girlfriends who had been convinced they were being too sensitive, too dramatic, too demanding? What can I do to help? The prosecutor on Brittany's case wants to introduce evidence of Marcus's prior conviction. Your testimony about the pattern of behavior could be crucial. But Sage, I want you to think carefully about this. Testifying would mean putting yourself back in a courtroom with your family, reliving everything again. I looked around the hospital cafeteria at the medical students discussing cases with the same analytical distance I'd learned to apply to my own trauma. In 2 years of working with brain injury patients, I'd seen dozens of young people whose families had failed them in similar ways. I'd helped create protocols that prioritized medical evidence over family narratives, that treated traumatic brain injury as the serious condition it was, regardless of the perpetrator's relationship to the victim. But I'd never had to face Marcus again, never had to sit across a courtroom from parents who still believed, on some level, that protecting their son was more important than protecting his victims. "I'll do it," I said. "Brittany shouldn't have to face this alone." That evening, I called Sarah to tell her about the email, about the new case, and about my decision to testify. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. "How do you feel about seeing them again?" she asked. "Terrified," I admitted, "but also angry. Not the kind of anger I used to carry, the helpless, consuming kind. This is different. This is the anger that comes from knowing that everything I predicted would happen if Marcus didn't face real consequences has come true." "What about your mother's email? The part where she said she finally understands?" I'd been avoiding thinking about that part, about the year's too late acknowledgement that my reality had been real all along. I think she's telling the truth about understanding now, but understanding after another girl gets hurt doesn't undo the damage of not understanding when it was me. Sarah was quiet again. "Do you want her to understand? Are you glad she finally sees it?" The question caught me off guard. For 2 years, I'd imagined what it would feel like if my parents ever admitted they'd been wrong, if they ever acknowledged that their response to my assault had been a betrayal as devastating as
What matters is that your testimony is truthful and relevant to establishing a pattern of behavior. The fact that you've become an expert in traumatic brain injury since your own assault actually strengthens your credibility. The night before the hearing, I stayed in a hotel near the courthouse rather than driving back to my apartment. I wanted to be close, to avoid any possibility of being late or delayed. I also wanted to be alone, to prepare mentally for seeing my family again. I'd testified against Marcus before, but that had been when I was still 17, still living in the immediate aftermath of trauma, still desperately hoping that someone would believe me. Now I was 20, a medical student, someone with professional credibility and emotional distance from the events. But lying in that hotel bed, I felt 17 again. I felt the fear and isolation of that week after the assault, when my own family had convinced me I was crazy for thinking I needed medical attention. I felt the terrible loneliness of realizing that the people who were supposed to protect me were the people I needed protection from. Dr. Wong had been right about trauma reopening. Even when you think you've healed, even when you've built a new life and found your voice and helped other people in similar situations, the original wound is still there. Changed, maybe, scarred over, but not erased. I called Sarah around midnight. "I keep thinking about tomorrow," I said, "about seeing them again." "Your parents?" "All of them. Marcus, Mom, Dad. I've spent 2 years building a life where I don't have to consider their feelings or manage their reactions or protect them from the consequences of their choices. Tomorrow, I have to be in the same room with them again." "You don't have to protect them from anything anymore, Sage. You're not responsible for their comfort level with the truth." I know that intellectually, but there's this part of me that's still 17, still hoping they'll finally see what they did to me and be sorry. And what if they are sorry? What would that change? I thought about Mom's email, about her admission that she finally understood I'd been right about Marcus, about her acknowledgement that another girl had been hurt because he hadn't faced appropriate consequences. "Nothing," I said finally. "It wouldn't change anything. The damage is done. Brittany still got hurt. I still had to rebuild my entire life without family support. Their regret now doesn't undo the harm their denial caused then. Then why does it matter what they think tomorrow? Because I'm human. Because even when you know better, there's still this primitive part of your brain that wants your parents to love you enough to choose you, to protect you, to believe you. Sage, They're going to see you tomorrow as a medical student, as an expert witness, as someone who survived what they put you through and became stronger because of it. They're going to see that you didn't need them to heal, that you found people who could give you what they couldn't. Is that supposed to make me feel better or worse? Sarah laughed softly. I don't know, maybe both. The courtroom was smaller than I remembered, but just as intimidating. Marcus sat at the defendant's table looking older, more serious. He'd lost weight, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Prison had changed him, though whether the change was genuine remorse or simple consequence was impossible to tell. My parents sat behind him, as they had before. Mom looked older, too, grayer, more fragile. Dad stared straight ahead with the same rigid expression he'd worn during my original testimony. Brittany sat with the prosecutor, wearing a navy dress similar to the one I'd borrowed for my first court appearance. The bruising on her face had faded, but the careful way she held her head suggested she was still dealing with post-concussion symptoms. When my name was called, I stood and walked to the witness stand with as much composure as I could manage. I testified in other cases since becoming involved in brain injury advocacy, but never with my own perpetrator sitting 10 feet away. Please state your name and occupation for the record. Sage Patterson. I'm a medical student at State University, specializing in neurology. I also work part-time as a patient advocate for traumatic brain injury cases at Children's Hospital. Miss Patterson, are you familiar with the defendant? Yes, Marcus Patterson is my brother. Can you describe the nature of your previous legal interaction with the defendant? I looked directly at Marcus as I spoke. 2 years ago, Marcus assaulted me with a textbook, causing a traumatic brain injury. He was convicted of second-degree assault and sentenced to 6 months in jail, plus probation and anger management. Can you describe the circumstances of that assault? I recounted the events of that night, but with the clinical precision I'd developed through medical training, rather than the raw emotion of my original testimony. The facts were the same, but my delivery was different. Calmer, more authoritative. What were your injuries? I sustained a concussion with brain swelling and bruising. The injury went undiagnosed for over a week because my family initially dismissed my symptoms as attention-seeking behavior. Have you reviewed the medical records from Miss Chen's current case? I have. In your professional opinion, are there similarities between Miss Chen's injuries and your own? The brain scan patterns are remarkably similar. Both show impact trauma consistent with blunt force injury to the head. Both show the kind of damage that occurs when someone is struck with a hard object wielded with significant force. The defense attorney objected, arguing that I wasn't qualified to make medical determinations. The judge allowed my testimony to continue, but instructed the jury to consider my level of training. Ms. Patterson, based on your experience both as a victim and as someone who now works with traumatic brain injury cases, do you see patterns in how these injuries are initially handled by families? Frequently, families minimize head injuries caused by domestic violence. There's often pressure on the victim to avoid seeking medical attention, either because of embarrassment about the family situation or because of concern about legal consequences for the perpetrator. This delay in treatment can be life-threatening. In your opinion, could the injury sustained by both you and Miss Chen have been accidental? I looked at the brain scan images displayed on the courtroom monitor, then at Marcus. The force required to cause the level of damage shown in both brain scans cannot be accidental. These are the results of deliberate, violent action. During cross-examination, Marcus's attorney tried to establish that I was biased against my brother, that my testimony was motivated by personal revenge rather than concern for justice. Ms. Patterson, isn't it true that you've had no contact with your family since your brother's conviction? That's correct. And isn't it true that you've built a career around being a victim of domestic violence? I've built a career around helping people with traumatic brain injuries get appropriate medical care.
But you've written a book about your experience, given speeches, built a public platform based on your victimization by your brother. I've shared my story to help other people recognize the signs of traumatic brain injury and understand the importance of seeking immediate medical attention. Ms. Patterson, if your brother had expressed genuine remorse, if he had completed his rehabilitation programs successfully, would that change your opinion about this case? The question was designed to make me look vindictive, unwilling to believe in the possibility of change or rehabilitation. My opinion about this case is based on medical evidence and behavioral patterns, not on my personal feelings about my brother's rehabilitation. Miss Chen has a traumatic brain injury that's consistent with violent assault. That's an objective medical fact that exists independently of my brother's remorse or rehabilitation. After my testimony, I sat in the back of the courtroom to listen to the rest of the proceedings. Brittany testified with the same clear-eyed determination I remember feeling during my own case.
She described the assault, her immediate decision to seek medical care, and her refusal to accept Marcus's attempts to minimize the incident. Dr. Martinez, the same doctor who had treated me, testified about the similarities between the two brain scans. A domestic violence expert explained the patterns typical of repeat offenders. Marcus's ex-girlfriend from high school, who had contacted me after my original case, testified about incidents of violence that she'd previously been too afraid to report. The defense called character witnesses again, professors who spoke about Marcus's academic performance in community college, a counselor from his anger management program who testified about his progress, friends who described him as gentle and remorseful. But the medical evidence was overwhelming. 2 nearly identical brain injuries, 2 years apart, a pattern of escalating violence toward intimate partners, a history of family systems that enabled rather than addressed the behavior. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. On the charge of assault in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. This time, I didn't feel the same surge of vindication I'd experienced at Marcus's first conviction. Instead, I felt exhausted sadness for Brittany, for all the women who would be hurt by men whose families taught them that violence was forgivable if you didn't mean it. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Mom turned and looked at me for the first time since I'd arrived. Our eyes met across the rows of seats, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Recognition, not just of my presence, but of what I'd become, of the person I'd been forced to become when she'd failed to protect me. She started to stand as if she might approach me, but I was already moving toward the exit. I had nothing to say to her that I hadn't already said, no comfort to offer for the consequences of choices she'd made 2 years too late to matter. Outside the courthouse, Brittany was surrounded by friends and family members who had supported her throughout the case. Her parents stood with their arms around her, solid and protective in a way that made my chest ache with old loss. "Sage," she called out when she saw me. "Thank you for testifying, for writing your book, for showing me that it was possible to be believed." "You didn't need me to be believed," I said. "You believed yourself. That's what made all the difference." As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is your mother. I saw you in court today. I wanted to tell you that I'm proud of who you've become. I know I don't have the right to be proud, given that I had nothing to do with it, but I am." I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it without responding. Pride from someone who had forfeited the right to it felt meaningless. Acknowledgement from someone who had abdicated their responsibility to give it felt hollow. But as I drove back toward my real life, my medical school classes, my work at the hospital, my apartment near campus, I realized something important. I hadn't testified for my mother's acknowledgement or Marcus's accountability or even for my own vindication. I'd testified because Brittany deserved to have the truth told about what had happened to her. And the truth,
as always, had been visible in the brain scans, objective, undeniable, immune to manipulation or reinterpretation. Medical evidence that spoke louder than family loyalty, clearer than character witnesses, more definitively than any amount of remorse or rehabilitation. 6 months later, I was in my final year of medical school when I got a call from Dr. Rebecca Chen at Children's Hospital. "Sage, we've been asked to consult on a case that I think you should know about. A 15-year-old girl with a traumatic brain injury. The family is saying it was a sports accident, but the injury pattern suggests assault. The girl is too afraid to contradict her family story." "What do you need from me?" "She read your book. She's specifically asking to speak with you." The girl's name was Emma Rodriguez, and she was tiny, maybe 90 pounds, with dark hair and eyes that held the careful wariness I recognized from my own mirror in the months after my assault. She was sitting in a hospital bed wearing a gown covered in cartoon animals, looking much younger than 15. "Hi, Emma. I'm Sage Patterson. I understand you wanted to talk to me." "You're the one who wrote the book about brain scans." "I am." "They're saying I fell during soccer practice, hit my head on the goalpost." "What do you say happened?" Emma looked toward the door, checking to make sure we were alone. "My stepdad pushed me down the stairs, but my mom says if I tell the truth, he'll lose his job. She says we can't afford for him to get in trouble." Another family choosing financial security over a child's safety. Another brain injury being explained away with a convenient lie. "Emma, what does your brain scan show?" "The doctor said there's swelling and bruising, that it's serious." Brain scans don't lie. They show exactly what happened to your brain, regardless of what anyone wants to tell about how it got that way. "But what if my mom is right? What if telling the truth ruins everything?" I sat down in the chair beside her bed, remembering my own questions 2 years earlier, my own terror at the prospect of disrupting the family system, even when that system was actively harming me. "Emma, can I tell you something I wish someone had told me when I was sitting in a hospital bed just like this one?" She nodded. "Your brain injury is already ruining everything. The truth can't make it worse. It can only make it stop happening." "What if no one believes me?" "The brain scan believes you, the medical evidence believes you, and I believe you." Emma's case followed a similar pattern to mine and Brittany's: family denial, delayed diagnosis, attempts to minimize the severity of the injury. But because of the protocols we developed at the hospital, because of the training we'd provided to emergency room staff, Emma's injury was taken seriously from the beginning. The social worker was called immediately. The brain scan was given equal weight to the family's story. Emma was interviewed separately from her parents in a setting where she felt safe to tell the truth. Her stepdad was arrested within 24 hours. 3 weeks later, Emma's mother came to see me at the hospital. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for helping Emma find her voice." "I didn't help her find it. She always had it. She just needed permission to use it. I'm sorry I asked her to lie. I was scared about money, about starting over, about being able to take care of her on my own. But I see now that protecting him meant I wasn't protecting her." "How is Emma doing?" "Better. The headaches are getting less frequent. She's going back to school next week. And she's talking about maybe becoming a doctor someday, like you." After Emma's mother left, I sat in my office looking at the newest addition to my wall, a photo of Emma at her sentencing hearing, surrounded by family members who had chosen to believe her rather than protect her abuser. She was smiling in the picture, but more than that, she looked confident, secure in the knowledge that the adults in her life would prioritize her safety over their convenience. It was a photo I'd never had of my own family, but seeing it gave me something I hadn't expected: peace. Not because my parents had ever learned to protect me, but because I'd learned to protect myself, and now I was helping other young people do the same. That evening, I was reviewing applications for medical residency programs when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Wong's number.
Sage, I have some news that I thought you'd want to hear directly from me. Good news or bad news? Excellent news. The neurology program at Johns Hopkins has accepted your residency application. They were particularly impressed by your research on traumatic brain injury in domestic violence cases and your work with young victims. Johns Hopkins, one of the most prestigious neurology programs in the country. A place where I could continue my research while training to become the kind of doctor who took traumatic brain injury seriously, who understood the intersection of medicine and family violence, who knew how to read the truth in brain scans when families preferred comfortable lies. There's something else, Dr. Wong continued. They want you to develop a specialized track for residents interested in traumatic brain injury. You'd be creating curriculum, training future doctors to recognize and treat these injuries in the context of domestic violence. I thought about Emma, about Brittany, about all the young people whose brain scans had told truths their families didn't want to hear. I accept, I said. You haven't even heard about the salary or the specific requirements. I don't need to. This is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment looking at the brain scan that still hung on my wall. The image that had changed everything, that had forced my family to confront a reality they'd preferred to deny. The medical evidence that had been stronger than gaslighting, more convincing than character witnesses, more definitive than any amount of manipulation. I'd spent 2 years learning to read brain scans professionally, understanding the subtle differences between different types of injury, the various patterns that could indicate abuse versus accident. But I still kept my own scan as a reminder of something more personal. The power of objective truth in a world full of people who preferred convenient lies. Tomorrow, I would start making plans for residency, for the next phase of my career, for the research I wanted to conduct on improving protocols for recognizing domestic violence in emergency medicine. I would continue working with young people like Emma, helping them understand that medical evidence could be their ally when their families failed them. But tonight, I allowed myself to feel something I'd rarely permitted: pride. Not in surviving what had happened to me, but in what I'd chosen to do with that survival. In the life I'd built from the ashes of the family that had betrayed me. In the voice I'd found when theirs had failed to protect me. My name is Sage Patterson. 2 years ago, my brother gave me a concussion and my parents said he didn't mean it. The brain scan said different. And that brain scan had become more than evidence of my injury. It had become the foundation of my calling. The proof that truth exists independently of family narratives, that medical evidence speaks louder than denial, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is trust what the science shows you, even when everyone around you is asking you to trust them instead. In 6 months, I would be Dr. Sage Patterson, specializing in neurology, focusing on traumatic brain injury, dedicated to making sure that no other 15-year-old girl would have to choose between her safety and her family's convenience. Because brain scans don't lie. And sometimes that's the only truth that matters. The emergency room at Johns Hopkins was controlled chaos on a Friday night in late October. I'd been an attending neurologist for 18 months now, and the rhythm of trauma cases had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. But when the paramedics wheeled in the 16-year-old girl with what they described as a possible fall downstairs, something in the family's body language made me pause. The girl, unconscious and intubated, had multiple contusions and what appeared to be significant head trauma. Her parents stood in the corner of the trauma bay, the father talking rapidly to anyone who would listen about how clumsy she was, how she'd always been accident-prone, how she must have tripped on her way to her bedroom. Too much explanation, too much detail, too much need to control the narrative before anyone had even asked for it. I pulled up her CT scan on the monitor and felt my stomach drop. The injury pattern was unmistakable. Blunt force trauma to the left temporal region, brain swelling, subdural bleeding. This wasn't a fall. This was assault. And if we didn't act quickly, this girl might not survive to tell anyone what had really happened to her. 5 years had passed since my own assault. 3 years since I'd graduated from residency and taken this position as the youngest attending in Johns Hopkins neurology department.
In that time, I'd seen hundreds of traumatic brain injuries, developed new protocols for identifying domestic violence cases, and published research that had changed how emergency rooms across the country approached suspicious head injuries. But standing in that trauma bay, looking at brain scans that could have been my own, I felt 17 again, vulnerable and alone and desperate for someone to see the truth. Dr. Patterson, the emergency resident, approached me. The family is asking about prognosis. They want to know when she'll wake up. What's her name? Alexis Chen, 16 years old. No prior medical history according to the parents. Chen. The same last name as Brittany, the nursing student Marcus had assaulted 3 years earlier. I wondered if there was a connection, if this was a relative, but pushed the thought aside. Right now, what mattered was the pattern of injury and the family's suspicious behavior. I want to speak with the parents separately, and I want social services called immediately. The resident looks surprised. The family seems very concerned. The father especially has been very cooperative, giving us detailed information about what happened. That's exactly the problem. In genuine accidents, families are usually too shocked to provide that level of narrative detail immediately. When someone is working hard to establish a story before being asked for one, it raises red flags. I'd learned to trust these instincts, to listen to the subtle signals that distinguished real accidents from covered-up violence. It was a skill I developed not just through medical training, but through lived experience with family systems that prioritize protection of perpetrators over care for victims. Alex's father, Robert Chen, was a man in his mid-40s who radiated nervous energy. He spoke quickly, gesturing frequently, repeating details about his daughter's supposed clumsiness with the kind of emphasis that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as us. "She's always been unsteady on her feet," he said for the third time. "Always falling, always bumping into things. We've told her to be more careful, but you know how teenagers are." "Mr. Chen, can you walk me through exactly what happened tonight?" I was downstairs watching television. My wife was in the kitchen. We heard this loud crash from upstairs, and when we went to check, Alexis was at the bottom of the staircase, unconscious. "What time did this happen?" "Around 8:30. "And what was Alexis doing before the fall?" "Going to her room to study. She had homework." "Had she seemed upset about anything? Any arguments or conflicts today?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "No, nothing like that. We're a very peaceful family. Alexis is a good kid." The emphasis on peaceful sent another warning signal. In my experience, families that needed to assert their peacefulness usually weren't. "Mr. Chen, I'm going to be direct with you. The pattern of your daughter's injuries is not consistent with a fall downstairs. The location and severity of the brain trauma suggests she was struck with significant force." His face flushed red. "Are you suggesting that someone hit her? That's ridiculous. We would never hurt Alexis." "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what the medical evidence shows. Your daughter has been severely injured, and the injury pattern indicates assault." "You don't know what you're talking about. You're just a doctor. You weren't there." The hostility in his voice confirmed what I already suspected. This was a man who was angry at being questioned, not a parent devastated by his child's injury. "Mr. Chen, I'm going to need you to step outside while I examine your daughter more thoroughly. Hospital security will be here shortly to ask you some additional questions." 20 minutes later, the social worker arrived. Maria Santos was someone I'd worked with on dozens of cases, a woman who understood the delicate balance between family rights and child protection. "What's your assessment?" she asked. "Classic pattern, traumatic brain injury consistent with blunt force trauma, family with an over-rehearsed explanation that doesn't match the medical evidence, and defensive hostility when questioned about inconsistencies. Any chance the girl will regain consciousness soon?" "The next 24 hours will be critical. The brain swelling is significant, but we've got her on medications to reduce intracranial pressure. If she makes it through the night, there's a good chance she'll wake up." "And if she does wake up, will she be able to tell us what happened?" "Possibly. Traumatic brain injury can cause memory loss around the time of the incident, but not always. Even if she doesn't remember the assault itself, she might remember what led up to it." Maria nodded grimly. "I'll get a court order for protective custody. If she wakes up, she won't be going home until we know what really happened." That night, I stayed at the hospital later than usual, checking on Alexis every few hours. Something about her case had gotten under my skin in a way that was both professional and deeply personal. Maybe it was the brain scan that looked so similar to my own. Maybe it was the father's defensive anger that reminded me of my own family's reaction when their narrative was challenged. Or maybe it was simply that she was 16, close to the age I'd been when my own world had collapsed. Around 3 in the morning, I was sitting in the ICU reviewing her latest neurological assessments when I heard a soft voice behind me. "Dr. Patterson?" I turned to see a young woman in scrubs, someone I didn't recognize from the night shift. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I heard you were treating Alexis Chen." "My name is Jennifer Chen. I'm her cousin." Another Chen. "Are you related to Brittany Chen?" Jennifer's eyes widened. "You know Brittany?" "Yes, she's my sister." The connections were starting to make sense. "I was involved in your sister's case 3 years ago. My brother was the one who assaulted her." "You're Sage Patterson! Brittany talks about you all the time. She said you saved her life by testifying." We stood there for a moment, the weight of shared experience heavy between us. "Jennifer, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Have there been concerns about Alexis's father before? Any history of violence in the family?" Jennifer looked around to make sure we were alone, then moved closer. "Uncle Robert has always had a temper. When Alexis was younger, there were incidents, nothing that left visible marks, but she would come to family gatherings with bruises she couldn't really explain. When Brittany's case happened, when we all learned about domestic violence and brain injuries, I started wondering about Uncle Robert. Did anyone ever report their suspicions? Who would we report to, and what would we say? That Alexis seemed scared of her father sometimes? That she had more accidents than other kids? It's not like we had proof. This was the reality I encountered constantly in my work. Families where everyone knew something was wrong, but no one felt empowered to act until the violence escalated to life-threatening levels. Jennifer, if Alexis wakes up and is able to speak, she's gonna need support from family members who believe her and prioritize her safety. Can she count on you for that? Absolutely. Brittany always said that having family members who believed her made all the difference in her recovery. What about Alexis's mother? Where does she stand in all this? Jennifer's expression grew complicated. Aunt Linda is complicated. She's been with Uncle Robert for 20 years. She's financially dependent on him, emotionally dependent on him. She's one of those women who has convinced herself that keeping the family together is more important than anything else. Another enabler, another woman who would choose the comfort of denial over the safety of her child. If Alexis tells us her father assaulted her, do you think her mother will support her? I honestly don't know. I hope so. But Aunt Linda has spent years making excuses for Uncle Robert's behavior. It might be hard for her to admit that she's been wrong all this time. At 6 in the morning, Alexis began showing signs of consciousness. Her eyes fluttered open, and she tried to speak around the breathing tube. I called for the respiratory therapist to assess whether she was ready for extubation. 30 minutes later, with the breathing tube removed and her airway stable, Alexis was able to speak in a hoarse voice. "Where am I?" "You're in the hospital, Alexis. You have a head injury. Do you remember what happened?" She closed her eyes, concentrating. "My dad was angry about my grades. He found out I got a C on my chemistry test." "What happened after he found out about the test?" "He started yelling. Said I was stupid, that I was embarrassing the family. I tried to go to my room, but he followed me." "Can you tell me what happened next?" Alexis's voice was barely audible. "He grabbed my shoulders and started shaking me. He was screaming in my face about how I was ruining his reputation, how other parents would think he couldn't control his own daughter. And then I tried to pull away from him, and he hit me with something. I don't remember what. Everything went black after that." "Alexis, when you tried to pull away, where were you?" "At the top of the stairs. I was trying to get to my room." So he had assaulted her at the top of the staircase, and when she lost consciousness, she had fallen down the stairs. The family's story about a simple fall was a lie designed to cover up assault that had nearly killed her. "Alexis, I need to tell you something important. Your parents told us you fell down the stairs by accident. That's not what happened, is it? Tears started running down her cheeks. He hit me. He hit me because I got a C on my chemistry test. I believe you. The medical evidence supports everything you're telling me. But I need you to understand that when your parents find out you're awake, they're going to want to talk to you.
You don't have to see them if you don't feel safe. I don't want to see him. I don't want to see either of them. You don't have to. There's a social worker here who's going to make sure you're protected. Your cousin Jennifer is here too, and she wants to support you. When Maria Santos arrived an hour later, Alexis repeated her story with remarkable consistency. No hesitation, no contradictions, no signs of coaching or manipulation. Just the clear, traumatic memory of a father who had nearly killed her over a chemistry grade. Alexis, I want you to know that you're safe now, Maria said. Your father can't come into this room. We've placed you in protective custody, which means no one can take you anywhere without court approval. What about my mom? Is she in trouble too? Your mother didn't assault you, but she did lie to medical personnel about what happened. That's a serious issue that we'll need to address. She knew? She was in the house when it happened. She helped create the story about you falling down the stairs accidentally. Alexis closed her eyes again, and I could see her processing the reality that both of her parents had chosen to protect her father rather than seek appropriate medical care for her. Dr. Patterson, she said after a long pause, my cousin Jennifer told me you went through something similar with your own family. I did. Not exactly the same circumstances, but yes. My brother assaulted me, and my parents initially chose to protect him rather than get me appropriate medical care. Did your family ever admit they were wrong? The question hit me harder than I'd expected. In all the years since my assault, through my medical training and career building and advocacy work, I'd rarely been asked such a direct question about my personal experience with family reconciliation. Some of them eventually acknowledged that they'd made mistakes. But acknowledgement doesn't undo damage, and it doesn't automatically rebuild trust. Do you ever regret speaking up, even though it cost you your family? I looked at the 16-year-old girl lying in a hospital bed with a traumatic brain injury, asking me the same question I'd asked myself countless times in the early years after my assault. Alexis, speaking up didn't cost me my family. It revealed that what I thought was my family was actually a system designed to protect the person who hurt me. The people who truly loved me, like my Aunt Sarah, supported me when I told the truth. The people who only loved me conditionally, as long as I didn't cause problems, showed me who they really were. I'm scared that my mom will hate me for telling the truth. I understand that fear, but here's what I've learned. If someone hates you for telling the truth about being hurt, they never really loved you the way you deserve to be loved in the first place. That afternoon, Linda Chen finally arrived at the hospital. She'd been notified that her daughter was awake and asking to see her, though Maria had insisted on being present for any conversation. Linda was a small woman who seemed to shrink further into herself when she learned that Alexis had told us what really happened. She's confused. The head injury is making her remember things wrong. Robert would never hurt her intentionally. Mrs. Chen, your daughter's memory of the assault is very clear and consistent. The medical evidence supports her account completely. But Robert is under so much stress at work. He didn't mean to hurt her so badly. There it was again, the familiar refrain of intent over impact, of excuses over accountability. Mrs. Chen, your husband hit your daughter hard enough to cause a life-threatening brain injury. Whether he intended that level of damage is irrelevant. What matters is that he chose to use violence, and then you both chose to lie about it to medical personnel. We were scared. We didn't know what to do. You could have told the truth so that your daughter could receive appropriate medical care. Linda started crying, the kind of tears that seemed more about self-pity than genuine remorse. I can't lose my husband. I don't know how to live without him. What about your daughter? How is she supposed to live with a father who nearly killed her? It was an accident. He lost his temper, but it was an accident. Maria stepped forward. Mrs. Chen, I need to be very clear with you.
Your daughter is in protective custody. She will not be returning to your home. If you want any relationship with her moving forward, you're going to need to demonstrate that you can prioritize her safety over your husband's convenience. What does that mean? It means supporting her decision to press charges against your husband. It means acknowledging that what happened was assault, not an accident. It means choosing your daughter's well-being over your marriage. Linda looked stricken. I can't do that. Robert is my husband. We've been together for 20 years. And Alexis is your daughter. She's been your responsibility for 16 years. The choice was laid out starkly, and Linda chose exactly as I had expected she would have. She chose the comfort of her established life over the safety of her child. When Linda left without seeing Alexis, claiming she needed time to think, Alexis wasn't surprised. "She's not going to choose me, is she?" she said quietly. "I don't know. People sometimes surprise you, either positively or negatively. But you don't think she will." I sat down in the chair beside her bed. "Alexis, I think your mother is a woman who has spent years accommodating an abusive man, and changing that pattern would require her to confront some very painful truths about her own choices. That's difficult work that not everyone is willing or able to do. So I'll be alone. You'll be safe, and you'll have people in your life who support you, like Jennifer, and other family members who choose to believe you. Sometimes the family you build is more reliable than the family you're born into." 2 days later, Robert Chen was arrested at his workplace. The charges included assault in the first degree, child endangerment, and providing false information to medical personnel. The local news picked up the story, particularly because of the connection to my research on family violence and traumatic brain injury. The headline read, "Local father charged in daughter's near-fatal assault. Case highlights hidden pattern of family violence." I'd learned not to read the comments on news articles about domestic violence cases, but Jennifer showed me one that had been posted by someone claiming to be a former neighbor. I always wondered about that family. The dad had such a temper, and Alexis always seemed so quiet and afraid. I wish I had said something sooner, but you never know if you're overreacting. This was the tragedy of family violence. The number of people who suspected something was wrong but felt paralyzed by uncertainty, by social pressure not to interfere in other families' business, by the fear of making things worse. If even one of those neighbors had called Child Protective Services years earlier, Alexis might never have ended up in my trauma bay with a life-threatening brain injury. 2 weeks later, Alexis was discharged from the hospital to live with Jennifer and her husband while the court case proceeded. Her cognitive function had returned to normal, though she would need months of physical therapy to regain her full coordination and balance. The day before her discharge, she asked me a question that stayed with me long after she'd left the hospital. "Dr. Patterson, do you think I'll ever stop being angry at my mother for not choosing me? I think your anger is appropriate and healthy right now. It's your psyche's way of protecting you from accepting treatment that you don't deserve. Whether that anger changes over time will depend partly on whether your mother changes her behavior."
But what if she never does? What if she stays with my father and keeps pretending this was all an accident? Then you'll learn to build a life that doesn't depend on her validation or support. It's not the life you probably imagined for yourself, but it can still be a good life, a safe life, a life where you're valued and believed. Is that what you did? Yes, and I've found that the people who choose to be in your life after they know your story, who choose to support you and believe you and stand with you, those relationships are often deeper and more genuine than relationships based on obligation or shared DNA. 6 months after Alexis's assault, I was invited to speak at a national conference on traumatic brain injury in pediatric patients. The audience was primarily emergency medicine physicians, neurologists, and social workers who dealt with cases of suspected abuse. My presentation was titled, "When Medical Evidence Contradicts Family Narratives, Protocols for Identifying and Responding to Domestic Violence in Head Injury Cases." I began with 2 brain scan images side by side, mine from 5 years earlier and Alexis's from 6 months ago. These scans were taken 5 years apart, in different hospitals, involving different families. But the injury patterns are nearly identical. Both show traumatic brain damage consistent with blunt force assault. Both initially presented with family explanations that characterize the injuries as accidents. I clicked to the next slide, showing the family's initial statements to medical personnel. In my case, the family claimed I'd been accidentally struck while my brother was moving past me with a textbook. In Alexis's case, the family claimed she'd fallen downstairs due to clumsiness. Both explanations were designed to minimize the severity of the violence and avoid legal consequences for the perpetrator. The next slide showed the medical evidence that contradicted these explanations. But brain scans don't lie. They show the objective truth about what happened to the brain, regardless of what story anyone wants to tell about how the injury occurred. In both cases, the patterns of damage were inconsistent with the family's explanations and clearly indicated assault. I spent the next hour walking the audience through the protocols we developed at Johns Hopkins for identifying suspicious head injuries, conducting trauma-informed interviews with young patients, and working with social services to ensure appropriate protection. But the part of the presentation that seemed to resonate most with the audience was when I talked about the long-term impact of family betrayal on recovery. Traumatic brain injury is devastating enough on its own, but when the injury occurs in the context of family violence, and when family members choose to prioritize the perpetrator's protection over the victim's care, the psychological trauma can be as significant as the physical injury. I showed statistics about recovery outcomes for young people with family support versus those without. Patients who have family members who believe them, support them, and prioritize their safety show significantly better outcomes in both physical recovery and psychological healing. This isn't just about having people to help with medical appointments and physical therapy. It's about having people who validate your reality and remind you that you deserve safety and care. After the presentation, I was approached by dozens of medical professionals who shared their own experiences with suspicious family dynamics in head injury cases. Many of them had felt uncertain about how to respond when medical evidence contradicted family explanations, unsure of their authority to challenge parents or guardians. But the conversation that affected me most came from a young emergency medicine resident who pulled me aside during the coffee break. "Dr. Patterson, I wanted to thank you for your presentation. 3 months ago, I had a case that reminded me of your research. A 12-year-old boy with a head injury, parents claiming he fell off his bike, but something felt wrong about their story. What did you do?" I ordered additional imaging that the parents didn't think was necessary. The scan showed injury patterns consistent with assault. When I interviewed the boy separately, he admitted that his father had hit him with a baseball bat. How did the family respond when confronted with the medical evidence? Exactly like you described. Defensive, angry, trying to convince me that I didn't understand the situation. But because of your research, I knew to trust the medical evidence over their narrative. What happened to the boy? He's safe now, living with his grandmother while his father faces criminal charges. His mother is in therapy, trying to understand why she participated in covering up the abuse. These were the conversations that reminded me why I'd chosen this specialization, why I'd built my career around the intersection of neurology and family violence. Every case where medical evidence was trusted over family denial, every young person who was believed and protected represented a life saved, not just from immediate physical danger, but from years of ongoing trauma. That evening, I was back in my hotel room reviewing emails when I found a message that made me smile. "Dr. Patterson, this is Alexis Chen. I wanted you to know that I started college last month. I'm majoring in social work with a focus on child protection. My goal is to work with families where there's suspected abuse, to help kids who are in situations like I was. I know it's probably not a coincidence that I chose this field. Your example showed me that you can take something terrible that happened to you and turn it into a way to help other people. Thank you for believing me when my own mother wouldn't." I replied immediately, "Alexis, I'm so proud of you for pursuing your education and for choosing a field where you can make a real difference. You're going to be an incredible advocate for vulnerable children because you understand from personal experience what it feels like to need someone to believe you. Keep me posted on your progress." 2 years later, I received an invitation that represented everything I'd hoped my work could accomplish. The invitation was to speak at the graduation ceremony for the first class of the Sage Patterson Fellowship Program for Medical Professionals in Trauma-Informed Care. Johns Hopkins had established the fellowship in partnership with several other medical schools, designed to train emergency medicine physicians, neurologists, pediatricians, and social workers in the specific skills needed to identify and respond to family violence in medical settings. The program covered everything from reading medical evidence that contradicted family narratives to conducting interviews that allowed young patients to feel safe telling the truth about their injuries. But more than technical skills, it focused on the mindset shift required to prioritize patient safety over family comfort, medical evidence over social convenience. As I looked out at the auditorium filled with newly graduated fellows, I saw the future of medical care for victims of family violence. These were doctors and social workers who understood that brain scans don't lie, that medical evidence deserves equal weight to family explanations, that believing young patients can be the difference between life and death. During my speech, I shared the story that had started it all, my own assault, my family's denial, the brain scan that had finally forced everyone to confront the truth. 5 years ago, I was lying in a hospital bed with a traumatic brain injury, being told by my own family that I was exaggerating, that I was being dramatic, that what had happened to me wasn't serious enough to warrant medical attention. I clicked to show my original brain scan on the large screen behind me. This image changed everything. Not because it told me something I didn't already know, I knew I'd been seriously injured, but because it provided objective evidence that couldn't be argued with or reinterpreted or explained away. I paused, looking out at the faces in the audience. Every person in this room now has the power to be someone's brain scan. You have the power to provide the objective evidence that cuts through family denial and social pressure. You have the authority to say this is what happened when everyone else is saying this is what we want to believe happened. The next slide showed statistics about the fellows' impact in their first 2 years of practice. Since this program began, fellows have identified over 300 cases of suspected family violence that might otherwise have gone undetected. They've helped establish protocols in emergency rooms across 12 states. Most importantly, they've demonstrated that medical professionals can be the first line of defense for young people whose families have failed to protect them. After the ceremony, I was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Kim, the prosecutor who had handled Brittany Chen's case, now working as a medical legal consultant. Dr. Patterson, I wanted you to know that your work has had an impact far beyond individual cases. The protocols you've developed are being used as models for medical legal cooperation across the country. What do you mean? We're seeing much better collaboration between medical professionals and law enforcement in cases involving family violence. Doctors are more confident about reporting suspicious injuries, and prosecutors are better equipped to present medical evidence in court. She handed me a folder containing recent conviction statistics. In cases where medical professionals have used your protocols for identifying family violence, conviction rates have increased by 40%. More importantly, we're seeing families that choose to support victims rather than perpetrators when presented with clear medical evidence. This was the systemic change I'd hoped for when I first started speaking about my experience. Not just individual healing, but structural shifts in how institutions responded to family violence. That evening, I was having dinner with several of the fellowship graduates when one of them asked a question that brought me back to my personal journey. Dr. Patterson, we've heard about your professional work and your research, but I'm curious about something more personal. Do you ever have contact with your family now? Has anything changed in those relationships? I considered how to answer. The truth was complicated and didn't fit neatly into narratives about either complete estrangement or happy reconciliation. I have limited contact with my Aunt Sarah, who supported me from the beginning. She's the one who provided me with a safe place to live when I couldn't return home. What about your parents, your brother? My mother occasionally sends cards on holidays with messages saying she's proud of my accomplishments. My father has never contacted me directly. My brother has written several letters over the years, all of which focus on his remorse and rehabilitation rather than acknowledging the full impact.
But I eventually realized that I was spending emotional energy on people who had forfeited the right to access my life when they chose his reputation over my safety. One of the fellows, a young emergency medicine physician, leaned forward. Do you ever regret that choice? Do you miss having a traditional family? I miss the idea of family that I had before I understood what mine actually was. I miss the security of believing that the people who raised me would always choose my well-being over their convenience. But I don't miss the reality of walking on eggshells, of managing everyone else's emotions, of pretending that violence was acceptable if you didn't mean it. What about forgiveness? Do you think forgiveness is necessary for healing? This was a question I'd been asked countless times in interviews, at conferences, by other survivors. The assumption that forgiveness was required for moving forward seemed to be deeply embedded in how people thought about recovery from family trauma. I think forgiveness is a choice that belongs entirely to the person who was harmed. For some people, forgiveness is part of their healing process. For others, it's not necessary or even helpful. What I've learned is that my healing didn't depend on forgiving people who hurt me. It depended on building a life with people who would never hurt me in those ways. But don't you worry about carrying anger or resentment? I think there's a difference between the kind of anger that consumes you and the kind of anger that protects you. I'm not consumed by rage about what happened to me. I've channeled that energy into work that prevents it from happening to other people. But I maintain a healthy anger that reminds me not to accept treatment I don't deserve. The conversation continued late into the evening, touching on topics that ranged from medical ethics to family systems to the long-term effects of trauma on career choice. These were discussions I rarely had outside of professional settings, conversations that required both clinical knowledge and personal experience. As I walked back to my hotel that night, I thought about the 16-year-old girl I'd been when this journey started. She could never have imagined the life I was living now, the career built around turning trauma into expertise, the relationships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation, the sense of purpose that came from using personal pain to prevent others' suffering. But more than that, she could never have imagined the peace that came from living a life aligned with her values rather than her family's expectations. The relief of not having to manage anyone else's feelings about her reality. The freedom of being surrounded by people who would believe her if something terrible happened. 6 months after the fellowship graduation, I received a phone call that brought my story full circle in a way I never could have predicted. Dr. Patterson, this is Detective Martinez with the Baltimore Police Department. We have a case I think you should know about. A 19-year-old college student was brought to the emergency room last night with a severe head injury. The family is claiming it was a fraternity hazing incident, but the medical evidence suggests domestic violence. What's the student's name? Marcus Patterson. Dr. Patterson, the admitting paperwork lists you as his emergency contact. The room seemed to tilt around me. Marcus, my brother, lying in a hospital bed with a traumatic brain injury, just as I had been 7 years earlier. Detective Martinez, I need to clarify something. Marcus Patterson is my brother, but I am not his emergency contact. I've had no contact with him in years. The hospital has you listed. Are you willing to come in and speak with us about his case? My first instinct was to say no, to maintain the boundaries I'd carefully established, to protect myself from being drawn back into the chaos of my biological family's dysfunction. But then I thought about the 19-year-old victim who might be lying in that hospital bed, who might need someone to advocate for them the way Dr. Martinez had advocated for me. I'll be there in an hour. The emergency room at University of Maryland Medical Center was busier than Johns Hopkins usually was, but the controlled chaos was familiar. I found Detective Martinez waiting near the trauma bay where Marcus was being treated. Dr. Patterson, thank you for coming. I should clarify, your brother isn't the victim in this case. He's the suspected perpetrator. The words hit me like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't been assaulted. He had assaulted someone else. Again. Who's the victim? A 19-year-old college freshman named David Park. He's Marcus's roommate at the university. According to witnesses, there was an argument in their dorm room last night that escalated to violence. What kind of argument? Apparently, David had complained to the resident advisor about Marcus's drinking and aggressive behavior. When David came back to the room last night, Marcus was waiting for him with a baseball bat. A baseball bat!
the same type of weapon he'd threatened to use against me years earlier, according to his ex-girlfriend's testimony. What's David's condition? Critical but stable. Significant head trauma, similar to what we see in your research on domestic violence cases. The injury pattern clearly indicates assault. Where is Marcus now? He's in custody, waiting to be formally charged. But Dr. Patterson, there's something else you should know. When we arrested him, he kept insisting that we contact you. He said you would vouch for him, that you would explain that he's not really violent. The audacity of it was breathtaking. After years of no contact, after assaulting another young person badly enough to cause life-threatening injuries, Marcus wanted me to provide character testimony on his behalf? Detective, I want to be very clear about something. I will not be vouching for my brother's character, but I would like to speak with David Park if he's able to have visitors. As someone who survived a similar assault by the same perpetrator, I might be able to help him understand what he's dealing with. David Park was awake but groggy when I entered his hospital room. He was smaller than I had expected, maybe 5'6" and 130 pounds. Marcus, at 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, would have had a significant physical advantage. David, my name is Dr. Sage Patterson. I'm a neurologist, and I'd like to talk to you about your injuries if you're feeling up to it. Are you related to Marcus? He said his sister was a doctor. Marcus is my brother, but I'm not here on his behalf. I'm here because I want to make sure you get the support and medical care you need. David's expression became wary. Are you going to try to convince me not to press charges? Absolutely not. I'm going to encourage you to tell the truth about what happened and to seek all available legal protections. Why? If he's your brother? I sat down in the chair beside his bed, the same position I'd been in countless times with young patients whose families had failed them. David, 7 years ago, Marcus assaulted me with a textbook hard enough to cause a traumatic brain injury very similar to yours. Your own brother hurt you too? Yes. And when I finally got the medical attention I needed, when the brain scans showed the truth about what had happened, I pressed charges against him. He was convicted and served 6 months in jail. And did that stop him from hurting other people? No. 3 years later, he assaulted his girlfriend in almost exactly the same way. She also had to have emergency brain surgery. He was convicted again and served additional time. And now me. And now you. David, you're the third person I know of who has been seriously injured by my brother.
There may be others who never reported what happened, or whose cases I'm not aware of. David was quiet for a long time, processing this information. The police said he might try to claim it was self-defense, that I attacked him first. What actually happened? I'd complained to the RA about Marcus drinking in our room and getting aggressive with other students. When I came back from the library last night, he was waiting for me with a baseball bat. He said I was trying to ruin his life by reporting him, and that he was going to teach me a lesson about minding my own business. Did you fight back? I tried to get the bat away from him, but he's so much bigger than I am. He hit me once in the head, and I went down. I don't remember anything after that until I woke up here. The story was horrifyingly familiar, an argument that escalated without warning, a weapon of convenience, a victim who was smaller and physically disadvantaged. The same pattern Marcus had followed in every assault case. David, I want you to know that you're going to be okay. Not just physically, although your brain scan shows that you should make a full recovery, but you're also going to be believed and supported through the legal process. How can you be sure? Because I'm going to make sure of it. I'm going to testify about the pattern of Marcus's behavior, about the similarities between your case and the previous assaults. I'm going to help connect you with legal advocates who specialize in these cases. Why would you do that? He's your family. David, family isn't about shared DNA. It's about how people treat each other. Marcus stopped being my family the night he chose to hurt me. You're a young person who was seriously injured by someone who should have been a safe person in your life. Protecting you is more important than protecting him. The next few months followed a pattern that was becoming familiar to me, though no less heartbreaking.
Marcus's legal team tried the same strategies they'd used in previous cases: character witnesses, claims of rehabilitation, arguments that this was an isolated incident brought on by stress. But this time, the prosecution had something they hadn't had before: a clear pattern of escalating violence documented across multiple cases with medical evidence that was impossible to dispute. I testified not just about my own assault, but about the research I'd conducted on repeat offenders, about the progression of violence in cases where initial consequences weren't sufficient to create behavior change. Dr. Patterson, in your professional opinion, does the defendant represent an ongoing danger to others? Yes. The defendant has now been convicted of assault resulting in traumatic brain injury on 2 separate occasions, and he's currently charged in a 3rd case with similar circumstances. The pattern shows escalating violence and a consistent choice to use force against physically smaller victims. What is the significance of the weapon choice in these cases? In all 3 documented assaults, the defendant used objects as weapons: a textbook, a water bottle, and a baseball bat. This indicates premeditation and intent to cause serious harm, not momentary loss of control. During cross-examination, Marcus's attorney tried to establish that I was biased against my brother, that my testimony was motivated by personal revenge rather than objective analysis. Dr. Patterson, isn't it true that you've built your entire career around being a victim of your brother's violence? I've built my career around helping people with traumatic brain injuries get appropriate medical care and legal protection. But you've also written a book about your experience, given speeches, established fellowships. You've profited from your victim status. I've used my experience to help other people in similar situations. The fact that this work has been professionally successful doesn't change the medical evidence about my brother's pattern of violence. Dr. Patterson, if your brother had shown genuine remorse, if he had successfully completed rehabilitation programs, would you still be testifying against him today? It was the same question I'd been asked in previous cases, designed to make me appear vindictive or unwilling to believe in redemption. My testimony is based on medical evidence and behavioral patterns, not on my personal feelings about my brother's rehabilitation. The defendant has seriously injured 3 people in 7 years. That pattern suggests that previous interventions have been insufficient to protect potential victims. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on charges of assault in the 1st degree with a deadly weapon. Because this was Marcus's 3rd conviction for violent assault, he was sentenced as a habitual offender to 15 years in prison. After the sentencing, I stood outside the courthouse with David Park and his family, who had supported him throughout the legal process in ways my own family never had for me. Dr. Patterson, David's mother said, "I can't imagine how difficult it must have been to testify against your own brother." "It wasn't difficult at all," I said honestly. "The difficult part would have been staying silent and allowing him to hurt more people." David, who was fully recovered now and back in school, asked me the question that had become central to my understanding of family and loyalty. "Do you think he'll ever really change? Do you think 15 years in prison will be enough to make him stop hurting people?" I don't know, but I know that's not my responsibility anymore. My responsibility is to make sure his potential victims have all the information and protection they need. Whether he changes is up to him. That evening, I received a text message from an unknown number that turned out to be from my mother. "I saw the news about Marcus's sentencing. I know you probably won't respond to this, but I wanted you to know that I understand now why you couldn't stay silent. I'm sorry it took me so long to see what you saw all along." I read the message several times, feeling the familiar mixture of sadness and emptiness that came from receiving apologies that were too late to matter. I didn't respond, but I did save the message. Not because I was ready to reconcile or because her acknowledgement changed anything fundamental about our relationship, but because it represented a kind of closure I hadn't known I needed. Confirmation that even she could no longer deny the pattern of violence that had defined our family for so many years. 3 days later, I was back at Johns Hopkins, back to the work that had become my life's calling. A new patient had been admitted with suspicious head injuries, an 11-year-old girl whose stepfather claimed she'd fallen off her bicycle. The brain scan told a different story. As I looked at the images on my computer screen, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The 17-year-old girl lying on a cold floor with blood trickling past her jawline, the brain scan that had forced everyone to confront the truth, the family that had chosen denial over protection, the new family I'd built from people who chose to believe me. Most of all, I thought about all the young people I'd been able to help because of what happened to me. David Park, who was back in college and considering a career in law enforcement. Alexis Chen, who was thriving in her social work program. Emma Rodriguez, who had become an advocate for other children in foster care. Hundreds of others whose cases had been identified and properly treated because of protocols that grew out of my own experience. The 11-year-old girl in the current case would be another chance to make sure that medical evidence was trusted over family narratives, that a child's safety was prioritized over adult convenience, and that someone with power chose to believe a vulnerable person rather than protect their abuser. As I prepared to examine her, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The 17-year-old girl lying on a cold floor with blood trickling past her jawline, the brain scan that had forced everyone to confront the truth, the family that had chosen denial over protection, the new family I'd built from people who chose to believe me. Most of all, I thought about all the young people I'd been able to help because of what happened to me. David Park, who was back in college and considering a career in law enforcement. Alexis Chen, who was thriving in her social work program. Emma Rodriguez, who had become an advocate for other children in foster care. Hundreds of others whose cases had been identified and properly treating because of protocols that grew out of my own experience. The 11-year-old girl in the current case would be another chance to make sure that medical evidence was trusted over family narratives, that a child's safety was prioritized over adult convenience, and that someone with power chose to believe a vulnerable person rather than protect their abuser. As I prepared to examine her, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The 17-year-old girl lying on a cold floor with blood trickling past her jawline, the brain scan that had forced everyone to confront the truth, the family that had chosen denial over protection, the new family I'd built from people who chose to believe me. Most of all, I thought about all the young people I'd been able to help because of what happened to me. David Park, who was back in college and considering a career in law enforcement. Alexis Chen, who was thriving in her social work program. Emma Rodriguez, who had become an advocate for other children in foster care. Hundreds of others whose cases had been identified and properly treated because of protocols that grew out of my own experience. The 11-year-old girl in the current case would be another chance to make sure that medical evidence was trusted over family narratives, that a child's safety was prioritized over adult convenience, and that someone with power chose to believe a vulnerable person rather than protect their abuser. As I prepared to examine her, I thought about something David had said after Marcus's sentencing. I'm not grateful that this happened to me, but I'm grateful that when it happened, there were people who knew how to help me. That was the difference between my experience and his. When I was 17 and lying in a hospital bed with a traumatic brain injury, there weren't protocols for recognizing family violence patterns. There weren't medical professionals trained in trauma-informed interviewing. There weren't advocates who understood the intersection of brain injury and domestic violence. But David